A brutal widow's whip cracked against innocent flesh in the frozen Wyoming wilderness. But she never expected the scarred Civil War veteran watching from the shadows, a man bound by a dying soldier's oath to protect the very child she tormented. What happens when an unstoppable force of cruelty meets an immovable wall of honor? Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story of courage and comment below with your city, so I can see how far this tale of redemption has traveled across the world. The winter of 1884 had settled over Wyoming territory like a burial shroud, thick and unforgiving. Snow fell in heavy curtains across the small town of Redemption, muffling the sounds of daily life and turning the world into a study of white and gray. But in the modest house on Elm Street, the silence was broken by sounds that made even the bitter wind seem merciful. Reed Maddox pressed his scarred face against the frost-covered window of his cabin, watching the scene unfold in the house across the way with growing horror. Through the thin walls and poorly fitted windows, he could hear the sharp crack of leather against flesh, followed by a child's muffled sobs. His weathered hands clenched into fists as he recognized the voice. It was Emma, the 12-year-old girl who lived under the care of Clara Stanton, the town's most respected widow, respected by everyone except Reed. He'd been watching Clara for weeks now, ever since that moment 3 months ago when recognition had struck him like lightning. The child's face, those distinctive green eyes, the way she carried herself despite her obvious fear, it all came flooding back to him in an instant that changed everything. This wasn't just any orphaned child suffering under Clara's roof. This was Emma Lark, daughter of Private James Lark, the man who had saved Reed's life at Antietam and died asking Reed to watch over his family. The memory hit him again now, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday instead of 22 years ago. The Confederate minie-ball had shattered Reed's left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the bloody Maryland mud. As darkness closed in around the edges of his vision, he'd seen the gray uniforms advancing bayonets glinting in the smoky autumn light. Then James had been there dragging him behind a fallen log, using his own body as a shield while he returned fire. "Promise me something, Reed." James had gasped, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth from the bullet that had found his lung. "If something happens to me, my wife Sarah, my little girl Emma, they're all alone in this world. Promise me you'll look after them." Reed had gripped his friend's hand, feeling the life ebbing out of it. "I promise, James. On my honor, I promise." But Reed had failed that promise at least partially. By the time he'd recovered enough to travel west, Sarah Lark had already died of consumption, and Emma had vanished into the network of orphanages and foster homes that dotted the frontier. For years, Reed had searched following false leads and dead ends across 3 territories. He'd almost given up hope when fate, or perhaps James's spirit, had led him to this godforsaken town and the terrible realization of what Emma had endured. Another crack of the whip. Another sob. Reed's jaw tightened as he pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out into the swirling snow. The wind cut through him like a knife, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. He'd made a promise to a dying man, and he'd be damned if he'd let that promise go unfulfilled any longer. The Stanton house sat like a cancer in the middle of Elm Street, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew despite Clara's reputation for propriety. Reed had learned enough about the widow to know that her public face bore little resemblance to the monster that lived behind closed doors. To the good people of Redemption, Clara Stanton was a pillar of the community, a devout churchgoer who had graciously taken in an orphaned child out of Christian charity. She ran the local boarding house with an iron fist and a reputation for cleanliness that drew travelers from 3 counties away. But Reed saw through the facade. He'd spent too many years reading men's souls in the crucible of war to be fooled by surface appearances. Clara Stanton was a predator, pure and simple, and Emma was her prey. He approached the house carefully, keeping to the shadows cast by the large elm tree that gave the street its name. The window to what he knew was Emma's room, little more than a closet under the stairs, was cracked open despite the frigid temperature. Through it, he could hear Clara's voice, sharp and cruel as a blade. "You worthless little gutter snipe. Look what you've done to my good tablecloth." The sound of another blow, this one delivered by hand rather than whip. "Your mother was a whore and your father was a coward, and you're no better than either of them." Reed's vision went red at the edges. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, and for a moment he seriously considered putting a bullet through Clara Stanton's black heart. Only the thought of Emma, what would happen to her if he was arrested or killed, stayed his hand. Instead, he forced himself to move closer, positioning himself where he could see through a gap in the curtains. What he saw made his stomach turn. Emma knelt in the center of a small, cramped room, her thin frame shaking with cold and pain. Her dress, if the tattered collection of fabric could be called that, was torn and stained, providing little protection against the winter chill. Angry red welts crisscrossed her bare arms and back where Clara's whip had found its mark. But it was her eyes that broke Reed's heart. Those same green eyes that had sparkled with life when her father spoke of her were now dull and resigned, the light nearly extinguished by months of systematic cruelty. Clara stood over her, a leather strap dangling from her right hand. The woman was tall and angular, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that might have been handsome once, but had been twisted by years of bitterness into something ugly and predatory. She wore a dark wool dress that emphasized her harsh features, and her pale blue eyes held all the warmth of a January blizzard. "Clean this mess up," Clara snarled, gesturing at a small puddle of spilled milk on the wooden floor. "And when you're done, you can go without supper again. Maybe hunger will teach you to be more careful with things that don't belong to you." Emma nodded silently, not trusting her voice. Reed watched as she struggled to her feet, her movements careful and painful. She was so thin that her bones seemed to press against her skin, and he realized with a surge of rage that Clara had been systematically starving the child as well as beating her. "And don't think I don't know about you stealing food from the pantry," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I count every crumb in this house, girl. The next time I catch you taking what isn't yours, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life." Reed had heard enough. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. He needed to get Emma away from this monster, but he had to be smart about it. Clara Stanton had money and influence in this town, while Reed was just another drifter with a bad reputation and too many questions in his past. If he simply took Emma and ran, they'd be hunted down within days, and Emma would likely end up in an even worse situation. No, he needed a plan, and he needed allies. He made his way back to his cabin through the swirling snow, his mind already working through the possibilities. The first step was to establish contact with Emma herself, to let her know that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone was watching out for her. Then he could begin building a case against Clara, gathering evidence of her abuse. It would take time, but Reed had learned patience in the long years since the war. He could wait as long as he knew Emma was gradually being brought to safety. His cabin was small, but warm, heated by a large stone fireplace that he kept burning around the clock during the winter months. The walls were lined with books, history, philosophy, literature that he'd collected during his wandering years. Reading had become his escape from the nightmares that still plagued him, the memories of battle that refused to fade even after more than 2 decades. Reed poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his favorite chair, staring into the dancing flames as he planned his next move. The first thing he needed was information about Clara's finances, her background, her connections in town. He also needed to learn more about how Emma had ended up in her care. There had to be legal documents, transfer papers, something that might give him leverage. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Reed frowned, setting down his glass and moving to the window. Through the frosted glass, he could see a small figure huddled on his doorstep, barely visible through the falling snow. His heart leaped into his throat as he yanked open the door. Emma stood there, shivering violently in her inadequate dress, her lips blue with cold and her bare feet already showing signs of frostbite. She looked up at him with those haunting green eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Please," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, mister, I don't have anywhere else to go." Reed didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, shocked by how light she was, and carried her inside. She was so cold that he could feel it through her clothes, and when he set her down near the fire, she immediately collapsed to her knees, her body racked by violent shivers. "Jesus Christ," Reed muttered, grabbing a thick blanket from his bed and wrapping it around her shoulders. "What happened, child? How did you get away?" Emma pulled the blanket closer, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. She locked me out," she managed to say. "Said I could stay outside until I learned to appreciate having a roof over my head. But the door, I remembered you watching the house sometimes. I thought maybe—" She trailed off, looking at him with a mixture of hope and terror. Reed knelt down in front of her, studying her face in the firelight. Up close, the resemblance to her father was even more striking. She had James's stubborn chin and the same way of holding her head when she was trying to be brave. "Emma," Reed said softly, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Emma Lark, you're James Lark's daughter." A tear rolled down her cheek. "You knew my daddy." "I did," Reed said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was the best man I ever knew. He saved my life during the war, and he made me promise to look after you and your mother. I've been searching for you for a long time." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and then something broke inside her. The careful composure she'd maintained for so long crumbled, and she began to cry. Not the quiet, muffled sobs Reed had heard through Clara's window, but the deep, wrenching cries of a child who had carried too much pain for too long. Reed gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe now. I'm going to keep you safe, I promise." As Emma cried against his shoulder, Reed's mind was already working. Clara would discover her missing soon if she hadn't already. She'd come looking, probably with the sheriff in tow, claiming that Reed had kidnapped her ward. He needed to move fast, but first he needed to take care of the half-frozen child in his arms. He carried Emma to his bed and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then set about preparing hot soup and tea. As she warmed up, the color gradually returned to her face, and she began to tell him about her life with Clara, stories that made Reed's blood boil with rage. "She says my mama was a sinner," Emma said quietly, cradling a cup of tea in her small hands. "Says that's why God took her away and why I deserve everything that happens to me. She makes me work from before sunrise until after dark, cleaning, cooking, taking care of the boarders. And if I make any mistake, even a tiny one..." She didn't need to finish. The welts on her arms told the story clearly enough. "She's wrong about your mother," Reed said firmly. "Sarah Lark was a good woman, a kind woman, and your father was a hero. They both loved you more than life itself, and they would be heartbroken to see what's been done to you." Emma looked up at him with wonder. "You really knew them." "I really did, and I can tell you stories about them that will make you proud to be their daughter." Reed reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. "This is your father and me, taken right before the battle where he saved my life." Emma took the photograph with trembling hands, staring at the image of two young soldiers in Union blue. Even through the faded sepia tones, she could see the resemblance between herself and the man on the left. "He looks like me," she whispered. "He does. And you have his courage, too. It took real bravery to leave that house tonight and come to me." A sudden pounding on the door made them both freeze. Reed's hand moved instinctively to his gun as a voice boomed through the wooden panels. "Open up Maddox Sheriff's business." Reed looked at Emma, who had gone pale with terror. "Hide under the bed," he whispered. "Don't come out no matter what happens." Emma nodded and scrambled under the bed, pulling the blankets with her. Reed waited until she was completely hidden, then walked to the door and opened it. Sheriff Tom Holden stood on the threshold, flanked by two deputies. Behind them, barely visible in the swirling snow, stood Clara Stanton. Her face was a mask of righteous fury, but Reed could see the calculation in her cold blue eyes. "Evening, Sheriff," Reed said calmly. "What brings you out on such a terrible night?" "You know damn well what," Holden replied. He was a big man running to fat in his middle years with thinning hair and a mustache stained yellow from tobacco. "Mrs. Stanton's ward has gone missing. She seems to think you might know something about it." Reed looked past the sheriff to Clara, who was watching him with undisguised hatred. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. I hope the child is found safe." "Don't play games with me, Maddox," Clara snapped. "Know you've been watching my house. My neighbors have seen you lurking around like some kind of pervert. Where is she?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Reed replied, his voice level despite the rage building inside him. "I've been here all evening reading by the fire." Sheriff Holden pushed past Reed into the cabin, his eyes scanning the small space. "You mind if we take a look around?" "Actually, I do mind," Reed said, "unless you have a warrant." Holden's face reddened. "Now see here, Maddox. A child is missing, possibly in danger. Are you really going to stand on legal technicalities?" "A child who's been systematically abused and starved," Reed said quietly. "Maybe the question you should be asking is why she ran away in the first place." Clara's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury beneath. "How dare you? Emma is well cared for in my home. I've clothed her, fed her, given her a roof over her head out of Christian charity. If she's run off, it's because she's an ungrateful little wretch who doesn't appreciate what she has." "Is that what you call it?" Reed stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Charity. What I saw through your window tonight looked more like torture." "You were spying on me!" Clara's voice rose to a screech. "Sheriff, arrest this man. He's obviously some kind of degenerate who—" "Enough," Holden said, holding up a hand. He studied Reed carefully, noting the man's calm demeanor and steady gaze. Holden had fought in the war too, and he recognized something in Reed's eyes that gave him pause. "Mr. Maddox, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you know where Emma Lark is?" Reed met his gaze steadily. "I know she's not where she should be, Sheriff, but then again, she hasn't been where she should be for quite some time." It was a careful answer, technically truthful, but revealing nothing. Holden seemed to understand the distinction. "All right," the sheriff said finally. "We'll continue searching. But Maddox, if I find out you're hiding that girl, there'll be hell to pay." "I understand, Sheriff." Clara started to protest, but Holden cut her off with a sharp look. "Ma'am, I suggest you go home and wait. If Emma's out in this weather, we need to find her quickly." After they left, Reed waited a full 10 minutes before allowing Emma to come out from under the bed. She was shaking again, but not from cold this time. "What's going to happen to me?" she whispered. Reed knelt down and took her hands in his. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this, I will not let you go back to that woman. I made an oath to your father and I intend to keep it." "But she has papers," Emma said. "Legal papers that say she's my guardian. The judge signed them and everything." "Papers can be challenged," Reed said grimly, "especially if we can prove they were obtained through fraud or false pretenses. Do you know anything about how you ended up with Clara?" Emma nodded. "After Mama died, they sent me to an orphanage in Denver. Clara came there about 6 months ago looking for a girl to help with her boarding house. She told them she was a respectable widow who wanted to provide a good home for a deserving child. She picked me because I was old enough to work, but young enough to—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Young enough to control," Reed finished for her. "Did she pay the orphanage?" "I think so. And she had letters of recommendation from people in town, the preacher, the bank president, others. They all said she was a good Christian woman who would take proper care of me." Reed's mind was racing. If Clara had indeed bought Emma from the orphanage through false pretenses, there might be grounds to challenge her guardianship, but it would require proof of abuse, and Emma's word alone might not be enough to convince a judge, especially against a woman with Clara's reputation and connections. "Emma," he said carefully, "I need you to think very hard about something. In all the time you've lived with Clara, has anyone else seen her hurt you, any of the boarders, neighbors, anyone?" Emma shook her head. "She's very careful. She only hits me when we're alone, and she makes sure the marks don't show where people can see them. And she warns me that if I ever tell anyone, she'll make things much worse for me." "What about the other people in town? Have you ever tried to tell anyone what was happening?" "Once," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to tell Reverend Benjamin when we were at church, but Clara was right there, and when I started to speak, she pinched me so hard I cried out. Then she told the Reverend I was feeling poorly and took me home. That night she couldn't continue, but Reed could imagine. He felt sick with rage and helplessness. Clara had been very clever building her reputation while systematically destroying the child in her care. It would take more than accusations to bring her down. But Reed had something Clara didn't know about time patience and a soldier's understanding of strategy. He wouldn't attack head-on where she was strongest. Instead, he would find her weaknesses and exploit them one by one. "Listen to me, Emma," he said. "Things are going to get difficult before they get better. Clara isn't going to give up easily, and she has powerful friends in this town. But I want you to remember something. Your father never gave up when things looked impossible, and neither will I. We're going to find a way to make you safe, and we're going to make sure Clara never hurts another child again." Emma looked at him with the first real hope he'd seen in her eyes since she'd arrived at his door. "You really promise?" "I really promise." Outside, the wind continued to howl, and Reed knew that Clara and the sheriff would be back with more searching. He needed to get Emma somewhere safe, at least temporarily, but where every boarding house and hotel in town would turn her over to Clara immediately. He needed someone he could trust, someone who might be willing to help a desperate child despite the risks. As if in answer to his thoughts, he heard another knock at his door, this one softer, more tentative than the sheriff's aggressive pounding. Reed motioned for Emma to hide again, then opened the door to find an unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Wilson stood on his doorstep, his medical bag in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. The doctor was in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He'd been the one to treat Reed's old war wounds when he'd first arrived in town, and the two men had developed a grudging mutual respect. "Evening, Reed," Wilson said quietly. "Mind if I come in?" Reed stepped aside and the doctor entered, stamping the snow off his boots. He looked around the cabin, his eyes taking in the scattered blankets and the two cups by the fire. "Heard there was some excitement tonight," Wilson said carefully. "A child gone missing in this weather. Terrible thing." "Yes," Reed replied, his voice neutral. "I heard about it too." Wilson nodded slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bottle of medicine. "I was treating young Emma Lark just last week," he said conversationally. "Nasty case of pneumonia. Of course, pneumonia is not surprising when a child is kept in an unheated room and given inadequate food and clothing." Reed said nothing, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Funny thing about pneumonia," Wilson continued, "it responds well to proper care, warmth, good food, medicine, but it can be fatal if neglected. I made that very clear to Mrs. Stanton when I treated the girl. And she seemed remarkably unconcerned about following my instructions, almost as if she didn't care whether the child lived or died." Wilson met Reed's eyes directly. "In fact, I got the distinct impression that she might actually prefer the latter outcome." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Reed realized that Dr. Wilson knew far more about Clara Stanton's true nature than he'd let on. "Doctor," Reed said slowly, "if you had evidence that a child was being systematically abused, what would you do about it?" "Well," Wilson said thoughtfully, "I suppose I'd document the evidence very carefully. Medical records, photographs of injuries, testimony from reliable witnesses, and then I'd present that evidence to someone with the authority to act on it, a judge perhaps, or a territorial marshal. And if the local authorities were reluctant to act, then I'd go over their heads, straight to the territorial government if necessary." Wilson paused, then added quietly, "Of course, such evidence would need to be gathered very carefully, and the child in question would need to be kept safe while the case was being built." Reed nodded slowly. "That could be dangerous for everyone involved." "Yes," Wilson agreed, "but some things are worth the risk." Another long silence, and then Wilson reached into his bag and pulled out a small jar of salve. "This is for treating rope burns and whip marks," he said matter-of-factly. "Very effective for healing damaged skin, and this," he added, producing a vial of dark liquid, "is laudanum, for pain. A few drops in warm milk will help a child sleep despite significant discomfort." Reed accepted the medicines, understanding the unspoken message. "Thank you, doctor." "Don't thank me yet," Wilson said grimly. "We have a long road ahead of us if we're going to bring Clara Stanton to justice. She has powerful friends, and they won't be eager to see their reputations tarnished by association with her crimes." "What do you mean?" Wilson moved closer to the fire, warming his hands. "Clara Stanton didn't build her reputation in a vacuum, Reed. She had help people who vouched for her character, who recommended her to the orphanage as a suitable guardian, people who profited from her boarding house business or who owed her favors. If she goes down, she's likely to take some of them with her. All the more reason for them to protect her." "Exactly. Which means we need to be very careful about who we trust." Wilson turned to study Reed's face. "The question is, are you prepared for what this is going to cost? Because I can tell you right now, it won't be easy." Reed thought about Emma, huddled under his bed, carrying wounds, both physical and emotional, that would take years to heal. He thought about James Lark dying in his arms with a request that had become a sacred trust. And he thought about all the other children who might suffer if Clara Stanton was allowed to continue her reign of terror. "I'm prepared," he said simply. Wilson nodded. "Then we'd better get started." As the doctor prepared to leave, Reed made a decision. "Emma," he called softly, "you can come out now." Emma emerged from under the bed, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the stranger. But when Dr. Wilson knelt down and smiled at her with genuine warmth, some of her tension eased. "Hello again, my dear," Wilson said gently. "How are you feeling?" Better, Emma whispered. Mr. Reed gave me soup and blankets, and I'm warm now. Wilson nodded approvingly, then opened his medical bag. Do you mind if I take a look at those injuries? I want to make sure they're healing properly. With Reed's encouraging nod, Emma allowed the doctor to examine her arms and back. Wilson's face grew progressively grimmer as he cataloged the evidence of systematic abuse. Old scars layered beneath fresh wound, signs of prolonged malnutrition, the telltale marks of restraints around her wrists. This is going to be very important evidence, Wilson murmured to Reed. I'll document everything in my medical files along with my previous observations about her condition. As Wilson worked applying salve to Emma's wounds and checking her overall health, Reed found himself thinking about the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were essentially declaring war on one of the most powerful women in redemption, a woman who had spent years building a network of allies and supporters. The odds were against them, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But as he watched Emma begin to relax under Dr. Wilson's gentle care, Reed felt the same determination that had carried him through the darkest days of the war. This was what James had died for, not just to save Reed's life, but to preserve the possibility that good could triumph over evil, that the innocent could be protected from those who would harm them. We're going to need more than medical evidence, Reed said quietly to Wilson. We're going to need legal help and probably financial backing. Clara won't go down without a fight. I know, Wilson replied. But there are good people in this territory, Reed. People who will stand up for what's right when they see the truth. We just have to make sure they see it clearly. After Wilson left, Reed sat with Emma by the fire, telling her stories about her parents and helping her understand that she was not alone anymore. But even as he comforted the child, his mind was working through the challenges ahead. Clara would not give up easily. She would use every weapon at her disposal, her reputation, her connections, her money, to destroy anyone who threatened her. And she would be especially vicious toward Emma, seeing her as a traitor who had betrayed the kindness she had shown. But Reed had learned something important in the war. Sometimes the most dangerous battles were fought not with guns and artillery, but with truth and justice. And sometimes, if you were patient enough and brave enough, truth could triumph even against overwhelming odds. As Emma finally fell asleep in his arms, Reed made a silent promise to his old friend James Lark. The war for Emma's freedom was just beginning, but Reed would fight it with everything he had, and this time he would not fail to keep his oath. Outside, the Wyoming winter continued its relentless assault on the small town of Redemption. But inside Reed's cabin, warmed by firelight and protected by a soldier's honor, Emma Lark slept peacefully for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new battles to fight. But tonight, she was safe, and that was enough to begin with. The first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows of Reed's cabin, painting everything in shades of pale gold and silver. Emma stirred in his arms, her small body instinctively seeking warmth as consciousness slowly returned. For a brief, precious moment, she seemed confused by her surroundings, the comfortable bed, the gentle crackling of the fire, the absence of pain. Then memory flooded back, and her eyes flew open in panic. "It's all right," Reed said softly, his voice immediately calming her fears. "You're safe. Clara can't hurt you here." Emma sat up slowly, wincing as her injuries protested the movement. The salve Dr. Wilson had applied the night before had helped, but she was still tender and sore. Through the window, she could see the aftermath of the blizzard snow, piled high against the buildings, icicles hanging like daggers from the eaves, and the town buried under a pristine white blanket that made everything look deceptively peaceful. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Reed had been asking himself the same question all night. He'd managed only a few hours of fitful sleep, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Clara would be back soon, probably with reinforcements. She couldn't afford to let Emma's escape go unpunished, not if she wanted to maintain her reputation and control. "Now we fight," he said simply. "But we do it smart. Dr. Wilson is going to help us build a case against Clara, and we're going to find other people who are willing to stand up for what's right." A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Reed tensed his hand, moving automatically to his gun, but then a familiar voice called out, "Reed, it's Sam Wilson. I've brought breakfast." Reed opened the door to find the doctor standing on his doorstep with a basket covered by a checkered cloth. Behind him, barely visible through the swirling snow that had begun falling again, Reed could see a figure on horseback watching from the street. "Company?" Reed asked, nodding toward the rider. Wilson followed his gaze and frowned. "Deputy Morrison, he's been following me since I left my house. Clara's getting desperate." They brought the basket inside, and Wilson unpacked fresh-bred eggs, bacon, and milk, a feast compared to the meager scraps Emma had been surviving on, as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had been systematically starved. Wilson examined her injuries again and made detailed notes in a leather-bound journal. "The documentation is crucial," he explained to Reed. "Courts require evidence, not just testimony. These photographs," he held up a small camera, "will show the pattern of abuse over time." Emma flinched at the sight of the camera, and Wilson's expression softened. "I know it's frightening, my dear, but these pictures will help make sure Clara can never hurt you or any other child again." As Wilson worked documenting each scar and bruise with clinical precision, Reed found himself studying Emma's face. Despite everything she had endured, there was still something unbroken in her spirit, a spark of defiance that reminded him powerfully of her father. James had possessed that same quality, the ability to endure terrible hardship without losing hope. "Dr. Wilson," Emma said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are there other children like me in Clara's house, I mean?" Wilson and Reed exchanged glances. It was a question that had been haunting both men. "Not currently," Wilson said carefully, "but Clara has had several wards over the years. 3 other girls before you, all of whom left under mysterious circumstances." "What happened to them?" Emma asked, though her expression suggested she already feared the answer. "I don't know for certain," Wilson admitted. "One supposedly ran away and was never found. Another died of pneumonia, the same illness you were suffering from when I treated you. The third was sent to work for a family in California, though I've never been able to verify that claim." Reed felt his blood run cold. If Wilson's suspicions were correct, Emma might not be Clara's first victim. She might not even be her first casualty. "We need to investigate those cases," Reed said grimly. "If we can prove a pattern of abuse, or worse." "Already working on it," Wilson replied. "I've sent letters to colleagues in other territories asking about the girls who supposedly left town, and I've been reviewing the medical records of the one who died. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, not pneumonia." Emma had gone very pale. "She tried to give me medicine once," she whispered. "After I'd been particularly difficult," she said. "It made me very sick, sicker than I'd ever been. I thought she was trying to help me, but the way she watched me while I was ill—" "What kind of medicine?" Wilson asked urgently. "A dark liquid. It tasted bitter like metal. She said it would help me sleep, but instead it made my stomach hurt terribly and gave me fever dreams." Wilson's face was grim as he made notes. "That sounds like arsenic poisoning. Small doses over time can mimic other illnesses, making it an ideal murder weapon for someone patient enough to use it." The full horror of Emma's situation was becoming clear. Clara hadn't just been abusing her, she had been slowly killing her, probably planning to claim another tragic victim of illness or accident. Only Emma's escape had prevented her from becoming the 4th child to die under Clara's care. Another knock at the door, this one more insistent than before. Reed peered through the curtain and saw Sheriff Holden standing outside, flanked by 2 deputies, and looking thoroughly irritated by the cold and the early hour. "Hide," Reed whispered to Emma, who immediately scrambled under the bed. Wilson quickly gathered his medical supplies and notes, tucking them into his bag. Reed opened the door with deliberate slowness, projecting an air of mild annoyance at being disturbed so early. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "back so soon." "Cut the act, Maddox," Holden said, pushing past him into the cabin. "Mrs. Stanton is beside herself with worry. That little girl has been missing for almost 12 hours now, and with this weather—" He gestured toward the windows where snow continued to fall steadily. "Terrible thing," Reed agreed. "Have you considered that maybe she ran away for a good reason?" Holden's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe you should be asking why a 12-year-old child would risk freezing to death rather than stay in what's supposed to be a safe home." Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his medical bag prominently displayed. "Sheriff, as the town doctor, I feel I should mention that I've been treating young Emma for malnutrition and other concerning symptoms." "What kind of symptoms?" Holden asked, his tone becoming more cautious. "The kind that suggest systematic neglect and abuse," Wilson said bluntly. I've documented everything in my medical records, and I'm prepared to testify that the child's condition is consistent with prolonged mistreatment. Holden looked uncomfortable. He was a political creature at heart, more interested in keeping the peace and maintaining his position than in seeking justice. Accusations against someone as prominent as Clara Stanton were exactly the kind of trouble he preferred to avoid. "Now see here, Doc," he said. Mrs. Stanton is a pillar of this community. She's taken in that orphan girl out of Christian charity and nearly killed her in the process," Wilson interrupted. "Sheriff, I have photographs and medical documentation that would shock you. That child has been beaten, starved, and possibly poisoned. If you don't act on this information, I'll be forced to take it to the territorial authorities." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Holden knew that Wilson carried considerable weight in the community, and his testimony could not be easily dismissed. But he also knew that challenging Clara Stanton would bring down the wrath of some very powerful people. "This is all very concerning," Holden said, finally. "But the fact remains that a child is missing. If either of you knows where Emma Lark is, you have a legal obligation to—" "What we have," Reed interrupted, "is a moral obligation to protect an innocent child from a monster. And if you can't see the difference, Sheriff, then maybe this town needs new law enforcement." Holden's face reddened. "Are you threatening me, Maddox?" "I'm stating a fact. Emma Lark is in danger, but not from the weather or from kidnappers. She's in danger from the woman who's supposed to be protecting her." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Reed could see Clara Stanton riding up the street with 3 men he didn't recognize. They were well-dressed and well-armed, with the look of professional gunmen rather than local citizens. "Looks like Mrs. Stanton brought reinforcements," Reed observed. Wilson moved to the window and studied the approaching riders. "The man in the black coat is Hank Cooper," he said quietly. "He owns half the territory and has political connections all the way to Washington. If Clara's called in Cooper's help, this situation just became much more dangerous." Reed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Hank Cooper was a name that carried weight and fear throughout Wyoming territory. He was known for his ruthless business practices and his willingness to use violence to protect his interests. If Cooper was involved, it meant Clara had more at stake than just her reputation. Clara dismounted and strode toward the cabin with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. She was dressed in an expensive fur coat and carried herself like royalty visiting peasants. Behind her, Cooper's men arranged themselves strategically, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Sheriff Holden," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the frozen air. "I trust you've arrested the man who kidnapped my ward." "Now, Mrs. Stanton," Holden began, clearly uncomfortable with the turn events were taking. "We don't have any proof that we have proof enough." Cooper interrupted, stepping forward. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Emma Lark is the legal ward of Mrs. Stanton, and this man," he gestured toward Reed, "has clearly taken her against her will." "That's not true," Dr. Wilson said firmly. "The child was in immediate medical danger, and Dr. Wilson," Cooper said smoothly, "I understand your concern, but you're overstepping your authority. Medical opinions are not legal facts, and they certainly don't justify kidnapping." Reed studied Cooper carefully, noting the man's confident bearing and expensive clothes. This was not someone who had gained his power through luck or accident. Cooper was intelligent, dangerous, and clearly had significant resources at his disposal. "Mr. Cooper," Reed said calmly, "I wonder what your interest is in this situation. It seems unusual for someone of your stature to involve himself in a local custody dispute." Cooper's smile was cold as winter. "Mrs. Stanton is a valued business partner, Mr. Maddox. Her boarding house has been very profitable for my investment group. We naturally want to protect our interests." The pieces were beginning to fall into place for Reed. Clara's boarding house wasn't just a business, it was part of Cooper's empire, which meant her reputation and continued operation were worth significant money to him. And if Emma's accusations became public, it could damage not just Clara, but everyone associated with her. "So this is about money," Reed said. "Everything is about money, Mr. Maddox, but it's also about law and order. We can't have vigilantes deciding which laws to follow and which to ignore." Emma chose that moment to cough softly from her hiding place under the bed. The sound was barely audible, but Cooper's eyes immediately fixed on the general area where it had come from. "Sheriff," Clara said with barely contained triumph. "I believe you'll find the missing child in this cabin. I demand that you search it thoroughly." Holden looked around the room helplessly. He was caught between the undeniable evidence that Wilson had presented and the overwhelming pressure being applied by Cooper and Clara. His political survival depended on making the right choice, but he was no longer sure what that choice was. "Mr. Maddox," he said finally, "I'm going to have to ask you to allow us to search the premises." "And I'm going to have to refuse," Reed replied. "You don't have a warrant and you don't have probable cause. What you have is the word of an accused child abuser and the pressure of a man who profits from that abuse." Cooper stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of an expensive pistol. "Mr. Maddox, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. You're interfering with legitimate business interests, and that's not something I take lightly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact. This territory has laws, and those laws protect property rights, including Mrs. Stanton's right to custody of her legal ward." Dr. Wilson moved to stand beside Reed, his medical bag held prominently in front of him. "And those same laws protect children from abuse and neglect. I have documented evidence that Emma Lark has been systematically tortured by Mrs. Stanton." "Allegations," Cooper said dismissively. "Unproven allegations from a man who has clearly been influenced by this stranger's wild stories." Clara stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Gentlemen, while you argue legal technicalities, a sick child is suffering. Emma needs her medicine, needs proper care. Every moment she's away from home puts her life in greater danger." It was a masterful performance, Reed had to admit. Clara had positioned herself as the concerned guardian while painting him as a dangerous kidnapper. And with Cooper's backing, she had the resources to make her version of events the official truth. But Reed had spent too many years fighting hopeless battles to give up now. And he had one advantage that Clara didn't know about Emma herself, who was old enough and brave enough to tell her own story. "Emma," he called softly. "Come out, sweetheart. It's time." There was a moment of stunned silence as Emma crawled out from under the bed. She was wrapped in one of Reed's blankets, her small face pale but determined. Despite her fear, she held herself with quiet dignity as she faced her tormentors. Clara's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of pure hatred before she composed herself. "Emma, darling," she said in a sickeningly sweet voice, "you've had us all so worried. Come along now, let's get you home where you belong." Emma shrank back against Reed, her entire body trembling. "No," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to go back." "Don't be silly, child," Clara said, taking a step forward. "You're not well. You need your medicine and proper care." "The medicine that made me sick," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "The medicine that tasted like metal and made me want to die." Cooper's eyes sharpened with interest, and Reed realized the man was evaluating Emma as a potential threat to his investments. "Sheriff Tien," Clara said quickly, "the child is obviously delirious. She needs immediate medical attention, which she can only receive at home under my care." "Actually," Dr. Wilson interjected, "she needs immediate protection from the person who's been systematically poisoning her." He pulled out his camera and began setting it up. "Emma, would you be willing to show these gentlemen your injuries?" Clara moved quickly to block the camera's view. "Absolutely not. I will not allow this child to be exploited and humiliated by these men's perverted fantasies." "What, perverted fantasies?" Reed's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call documenting child abuse?" "I call it what it is, a sick man's attempt to justify his criminal behavior." Sheriff Holden was looking more and more uncomfortable as the situation spiraled beyond his control. He was a simple man who had never signed up for this kind of confrontation. "Look," he said desperately, "maybe we can work something out, some kind of compromise that—" "There is no compromise when it comes to child abuse," Dr. Wilson said firmly. "Either we protect this girl or we're all complicit in whatever happens to her." Cooper had been watching the exchange with the calculating expression of a poker player studying his cards. Now he stepped forward with the confidence of someone who was about to play a winning hand. "Mr. Maddox," he said smoothly, "you seem like a reasonable man. I'm prepared to make you an offer that might resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction. I'm listening." "My sources tell me you're a drifter, a man without permanent ties or significant resources. That must be a difficult way to live, especially as you get older." Cooper's smile was predatory. I could offer you employment, well-paid employment that would give you the stability and security you've been lacking. Reed understood immediately. Cooper was offering him a bribe wrapped in the language of legitimate business. Accept the job, abandon Emma, and everyone would pretend this confrontation had never happened. What kind of employment? Reed asked, playing for time. Security work. I have extensive business interests throughout the territory, and I'm always in need of experienced men who know how to handle themselves in difficult situations. And in exchange, you'd recognize that family matters are best handled within the family. Mrs. Stanton and Emma would work out their differences privately without outside interference. It was a generous offer by the standards of the frontier, and Reed could see that Holden was hoping he would accept it. Even Dr. Wilson was watching him carefully, perhaps wondering if he would choose self-interest over principle. But Reed was thinking about James Lark dying in the mud at Antietam with a request that had become a sacred trust. He was thinking about the other children who might have suffered under Clara's care and the ones who might suffer in the future if she wasn't stopped. "Mr. Cooper," he said quietly, "that's a very generous offer, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Cooper's expression didn't change, but Reed could see the cold calculation behind his eyes. "That's unfortunate. I had hoped we could resolve this like civilized men. We still can. Just walk away and let the law take its proper course." "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Mr. Maddox, Mrs. Stanton's reputation is very important to my business interests, and your accusations, however unfounded, could damage that reputation irreparably." The threat was now explicit, and Reed could see Holden's Adam's apple bobbing as the sheriff swallowed nervously. The man was clearly out of his depth and looking for any excuse to avoid making a decision. Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his camera now ready. "Emma," he said gently, "would you be willing to show Sheriff Holden your injuries, just so he can see for himself what Mrs. Stanton has done to you?" Emma looked up at Reed, who nodded encouragingly. With trembling hands, she began to unwrap the blanket, revealing the network of scars and fresh wounds that covered her thin arms. The effect was immediate and devastating. Even Holden, for all his political calculations, could not deny the evidence of systematic abuse. The wounds were too numerous, too methodical, too clearly the result of prolonged torture to be explained away. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies whispered, his face pale with shock. Clara moved quickly to damage control. "Those injuries are self-inflicted," she said desperately. "The child has a history of hurting herself when she doesn't get her way. It's one of the reasons she requires such careful supervision." But even as she spoke, Dr. Wilson was taking photographs documenting the evidence with clinical precision. And Emma, finding courage she didn't know she possessed, began to speak. "She did this to me," she said, her voice clear and strong, despite her fear. "Every time I made a mistake, every time I was too slow or too clumsy, she would beat me with a leather strap. And when that wasn't enough, she would lock me in the cold room without food or water." "The child is lying," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "She's been poisoned against me by this man's lies." "What about the medicine you gave me?" Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The dark liquid that made me so sick I wished I could die. Was that a lie too?" Cooper's face had gone very still, and Reed realized the man was calculating whether Emma posed too great a threat to his interests to be allowed to live. The thought sent a chill down his spine, and he moved protectively closer to the child. Sheriff Holden was staring at Emma's injuries with a mixture of horror and confusion. "Mrs. Stanton," he said slowly, "how do you explain these wounds? I don't have to explain anything to you." Clara snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. "This is my legal ward, and what happens in my home is my business." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Even Holden could not ignore such a blatant admission of indifference to child welfare. "Actually, ma'am," he said with growing confidence, "child welfare is the law's business, and based on what I'm seeing here," he gestured toward Emma's injuries, "I think we need to have a long conversation about your guardianship of this girl." Cooper stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "Sheriff, I think you're overreaching your authority. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. With respect, Mr. Cooper, child abuse is definitely a criminal matter, and if you're threatening a peace officer in the performance of his duty..." The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Reed could see Cooper weighing his options, calculating whether the situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. Clara was watching him desperately, clearly hoping he would use his influence to make the problem disappear. But Dr. Wilson was still taking photographs, creating a permanent record that would be difficult to suppress or explain away. And Emma's testimony, delivered with the simple honesty of a child telling the truth, was more powerful than any legal argument. "Mr. Cooper," Reed said quietly, "you might want to consider cutting your losses. Whatever Mrs. Stanton has been paying you, it's not worth associating yourself with child murder." "Murder?" Cooper's eyebrows rose. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Maddox. It's a very serious crime, and Dr. Wilson has evidence that Clara has been slowly poisoning Emma, just like she probably poisoned the other children who died in her care." Emma gasped, and Reed realized she hadn't fully understood the extent of Clara's crimes until that moment. The knowledge that she had barely escaped death seemed to strengthen rather than terrify her. "There were others," she said, her voice filled with sad understanding. "She told me about them sometimes when she was angry, said they were weak and worthless, and that's why God took them away." Clara's face had gone ashen. "The child is delusional," she said, but her voice was barely a whisper now. Wilson lowered his camera and fixed Clara with a steady stare. "Mrs. Stanton, I have medical records going back 5 years. 3 children died under suspicious circumstances while in your care. Would you like to explain that pattern?" The silence stretched like a taut wire, everyone waiting to see who would break first. Reed could see the desperation in Clara's eyes, the realization that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond repair. It was Cooper who broke the deadlock, his business instincts overriding his loyalty to Clara. "Sheriff," he said smoothly, "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about Mrs. Stanton's methods. Perhaps it would be best if the child were placed in temporary custody while these matters are investigated." Clara whirled on him with fury. "You can't abandon me now? We had an agreement. We had a business arrangement," Cooper corrected coldly. "And that arrangement is no longer profitable for either of us." Reed watched with grim satisfaction as Clara's support network collapsed around her. Without Cooper's backing, she was just another accused criminal facing the consequences of her actions. But he also knew that Cooper's abandonment made Clara even more dangerous. A cornered animal was always the most vicious, and Clara still had cards to play. "Very well," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "If you all want to destroy an innocent woman's reputation based on the lies of a disturbed child, so be it, but don't think this ends here." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Emma with undisguised hatred. "You ungrateful little wretch," she hissed. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. Your mother was a whore, and you're following in her footsteps. You'll end up in the gutter where you belong." The words hit Emma like physical blows, and Reed saw her flinch as if she'd been struck. But instead of breaking down, she stood straighter and met Clara's gaze with quiet dignity. "My mother was a good woman," she said firmly. "And my father was a hero. You can't change that no matter what you do to me." Clara's face twisted with rage, and for a moment Reed thought she might actually attack the child. But Cooper's men were already mounting their horses, and she seemed to realize that her moment of power had passed. "This isn't over," she said, directing her words toward Reed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with or what you've set in motion." As Clara and Cooper's party rode away through the falling snow, Reed felt no sense of victory. He knew they had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Clara still had resources and connections, and her threat had been very real. Sheriff Holden cleared his throat nervously. "Well," he said, "I suppose we need to figure out what to do about custody arrangements. The child can't stay with Mrs. Stanton, obviously, but she stays with me," Reed said firmly, "at least until we can find a permanent solution." "Now, I don't know if that's legally possible," Holden began. Dr. Wilson stepped forward with his medical bag. "Sheriff, as the attending physician, I'm recommending that Emma remain in Mr. Maddox's care pending a full investigation. She requires ongoing medical treatment, and given the trauma she's suffered, removing her to another unfamiliar environment could be psychologically damaging." It was a carefully worded medical opinion that gave Holden the legal cover he needed to avoid making a difficult decision. The sheriff nodded gratefully. "All right then. Mr. Maddox, you're temporarily responsible for the child's welfare, but I'll need regular reports from Dr. Wilson about her condition, and we'll need to schedule a hearing with the territorial judge as soon as possible. After the officials left, Reed found himself alone with Emma and Dr. Wilson. The child was exhausted from the confrontation, her small frame trembling with delayed reaction to the stress. "You were very brave," Reed told her. "Your father would be proud of you." Emma managed a small smile, but Reed could see the fear still lurking in her eyes. "Is it really over?" she asked. Reed and Dr. Wilson exchanged glances. They both knew that Clara's parting threat had been more than just angry words. She still had resources and connections that she could use against them, and her reputation for vindictiveness was well established. "No," Reed said honestly. "It's not over yet, but we've taken the first step, and we're not going to stop until you're truly safe." Dr. Wilson packed up his equipment and prepared to leave. "I'll have these photographs developed today," he said, "and I'll send copies to the territorial authorities along with my medical report. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case becomes." After he left, Reed sat with Emma by the fire, trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, they had gone from desperate fugitives to having the protection of the law, however temporary that protection might be. But Reed knew that Clara would not give up easily. She had too much to lose, and she had already demonstrated her willingness to kill, to protect her secrets. The next phase of their battle would be even more dangerous than what they had just survived. As if reading his thoughts, Emma looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes that so reminded him of her father. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "what happens if they take me away from you?" "They won't," Reed said firmly. "I made a promise to your father, and I intend to keep it. Whatever it takes, Emma, I'm going to make sure you're safe and free." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in deceptive peace. But Reed knew that beneath that peaceful surface, dark forces were already beginning to move. Clara would regroup, find new allies, and launch a counterattack designed to destroy anyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. The real battle was just beginning, and Reed could only hope that when it was over, justice would finally triumph over the forces of cruelty and greed that had held Emma captive for so long. The first sign of Clara's counterattack came 3 days later, just as Reed was beginning to hope they might have a brief respite to plan their next moves. Emma was slowly gaining strength under Dr. Wilson's care and Reed's patient attention, and for the first sign of Clara's counterattack came 3 days later, just as Reed was beginning to hope they might have a brief respite to plan their next moves. Emma was slowly gaining strength under Dr. Wilson's care and Reed's patient attention, and for the first time since her arrival, she had actually laughed at one of his stories about her father's mischievous youth. That fragile peace shattered when Sheriff Holden arrived at Reed's cabin with a grim expression and an official-looking document in his weathered hands. "I'm sorry, Reed," Holden said without preamble. "Judge Patterson has issued a temporary restraining order. You're required to surrender custody of Emma immediately pending a formal hearing." Reed felt his blood turn to ice as he read the legal papers. The language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear. Clara had found a way to use the legal system against them. "On what grounds?" Dr. Wilson demanded. He had been examining Emma's healing injuries when Holden arrived, and his face was flushed with indignation. "Improper guardianship of a minor child," Holden read from his notes. "The petition states that Mr. Maddox has no legal standing to care for the girl, and that his continued custody presents a danger to her welfare." Emma had gone very still at the mention of being taken away. She pressed herself against Reed's side, her small hands clutching at his sleeve with desperate strength. "This is Clara's doing," Reed said grimly. "She's found a way to turn the law against us." "Maybe so," Holden replied, "but the order is legal and binding. The child has to be placed in official custody until the hearing." "What kind of custody?" Dr. Wilson asked suspiciously. Holden's uncomfortable expression told them everything they needed to know before he spoke. "The judge has designated Mrs. Stanton as temporary guardian given her previous legal relationship with the child." "Absolutely not," Reed said, his voice deadly quiet. "I won't let you take her back to that monster." "Reed, I understand how you feel, but do you—" Reed's hand moved subtly toward his gun. "Do you understand that you're signing this child's death warrant because that's exactly what you're doing?" Emma began to tremble violently, and Reed could feel her terror radiating through her small frame. The progress they had made over the past few days was crumbling before his eyes, and he realized that Clara's strategy was more diabolical than he had imagined. "There has to be another option," Dr. Wilson said desperately. "What about placing her with a foster family?" "The judge was very specific," Holden replied. "Mrs. Stanton retains legal custody until a formal hearing can determine permanent placement." Reed's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. He could refuse to comply and fight his way out of town, but that would make him a fugitive and ultimately put Emma in even greater danger. He could try to appeal to Judge Patterson directly, but if Clara had gotten to the judge, that avenue was likely closed. "When is the hearing scheduled?" he asked. 2 weeks from today. The judge is waiting for some kind of investigation to be completed." 2 weeks. Reed felt his heart sink as he realized what that meant. Clara would have Emma back in her power for 2 full weeks with no oversight and no protection. Anything could happen in that time and probably would. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice so small it was barely audible. "Please don't make me go back to her." The raw terror in her voice nearly broke Reed's composure. He knelt down and took her hands in his, looking directly into those green eyes that reminded him so powerfully of her father. "Emma, listen to me very carefully," he said. "I'm not going to let Clara hurt you again. Do you understand me? No matter what happens, no matter where they take you, I will find a way to protect you." "How?" she asked, tears beginning to stream down her face. "She has papers and judges and important friends. What can you do against all that?" Reed thought about James Lark dying in the mud with a request that had become a sacred oath. He thought about the promises he had made and the failures he had endured, and he made a decision that would change everything. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a man has to choose between following the law and doing what's right, and when that time comes, the choice is easy." Dr. Wilson understood immediately. "Reed, you can't be thinking what I think you're thinking. That would make you an outlaw." "I've been worse things," Reed replied, "and I've survived them all." Sheriff Holden was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he sensed the direction the conversation was taking. "Now, Reed, don't do anything foolish. This is a legal matter, and it needs to be resolved through legal channels. Legal channels that are controlled by the same people who want to put this child back in the hands of her abuser," Reed said. "No, Sheriff. The law has failed Emma once already. I won't let it fail her again." A commotion outside interrupted their tense standoff. Through the window, Reed could see Clara Stanton approaching with a small entourage of supporters. She rode in a fancy buggy driven by one of Cooper's men, and behind her came several townspeople who had apparently been recruited to witness Emma's return to proper custody. "She's here," Emma whispered, and Reed could feel her entire body beginning to shake with terror. Clara dismounted from the buggy with theatrical grace, clearly enjoying her moment of triumph. She wore her finest dress and carried herself with the air of a righteous woman reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Behind her, Reed recognized several prominent citizens, the bank president, the mayor, even Reverend Benjamin from the local church. "Sheriff Holden," Clara called out in a voice that carried across the frozen yard. "I trust you have everything in order." Holden stepped outside, the legal papers clutched in his hand. "Yes, ma'am. The child will be returned to your custody as ordered by Judge Patterson." Clara's smile was cold and triumphant as she turned toward Reed's cabin. "Emma, dear," she called sweetly, "it's time to come home. I've prepared your room, and there's hot soup waiting for you." The false kindness in her voice made Reed's skin crawl. He could see the calculation behind Clara's performance. She was playing the role of the concerned guardian for the benefit of her audience, while making subtle threats that only Emma would understand. Emma had gone completely rigid with fear. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go back there." Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his medical bag prominently displayed. "Mrs. Stanton, as Emma's physician, I must protest this arrangement. The child is still recovering from serious injuries, and removing her from a stable environment could cause severe psychological trauma." "Dr. Wilson?" Clara replied with poisonous sweetness. "I appreciate your concern, but Emma belongs with her legal guardian. I assure you she will receive the best possible care in my home." "The same care she received before?" Reed asked, stepping into the doorway. "The kind of care that nearly killed her?" A murmur ran through Clara's entourage as they heard the accusation. Most of them were seeing Reed for the first time, and his imposing presence and obvious military bearing gave weight to his words. "Mr. Maddox," Clara said, her voice hardening slightly, "you have poisoned that poor child's mind with your lies and fantasies. But the truth will come out at the hearing, and then everyone will see you for what you really are." "And what am I, Mrs. Stanton?" "A disturbed drifter who has developed an unhealthy obsession with an innocent child. The kind of man that decent people cross the street to avoid." It was a masterful performance, Reed had to admit. Clara was painting him as a predator while positioning herself as the child's protector, and her audience, lacking any real knowledge of the situation, seemed inclined to believe her version of events. But Emma chose that moment to step into view, and the sight of her thin, scarred frame told a different story than Clara's words. Even wrapped in Reed's coat and blankets, her obvious malnutrition and the visible marks of abuse were impossible to ignore. Reverend Benjamin, a kind man in his 60s who had known Emma since her arrival in town, stepped forward with a troubled expression. "My dear child," he said gently, "you look unwell. Have you been eating properly?" Emma looked up at him with those haunting green eyes, and Reed could see her struggling with the desire to tell the truth and her terror of the consequences. "Answer the Reverend Emma," Clara said, her voice carrying a subtle threat that only the child would recognize. "Tell him how well you've been cared for." The moment stretched like a taut wire, and Reed realized that everything might depend on what Emma said next. If she backed down now, if she allowed Clara to intimidate her into silence, their case would be severely weakened. But Emma Lark was her father's daughter, and James had never backed down from a fight when innocent lives were at stake. "Reverend Benjamin," she said, her voice small but clear. "Mrs. Stanton beats me with a leather strap when I make mistakes. She locks me in the cold room without food when I displease her, and she gives me medicine that makes me very sick." The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly, and Reverend Benjamin's face went ashen with shock. Clara's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the fury beneath. "The child is obviously delirious," she said quickly. "She's been poisoned against me by this man's lies." But Dr. Wilson was already opening his medical bag, pulling out the photographs he had taken of Emma's injuries. "Reverend, perhaps you should see the evidence for yourself." The photographs passed from hand to hand through the crowd, and Reed could see the mood shifting as people realized the extent of Emma's suffering. These were not the minor scrapes and bruises of an active child, they were the systematic marks of prolonged torture. "My God," whispered the bank president, a portly man named Hamilton, who had known Clara for years. "How could this happen?" Clara was fighting for control now, her careful composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. "Those injuries are self-inflicted," she said desperately. "The child has always been disturbed, prone to hurting herself when she doesn't get her way." "That's a lie," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You did this to me, you and nobody else." The crowd was becoming increasingly agitated as the truth became impossible to deny. Reed could see doubt and disgust replacing the sympathy that Clara had been counting on. But he also noticed that Cooper's man was still with them, watching the proceedings with the cold calculation of a professional. And Reed realized that Clara's backup plan might be more violent than legal maneuvering. "This has gone far enough," Sheriff Holden said, clearly uncomfortable with the turn events had taken. "Regardless of these allegations, I have a legal order to carry out." "Sheriff," Reverend Benjamin said firmly, "you cannot seriously consider returning this child to a situation where she has obviously been abused." "The order comes from Judge Patterson himself," Holden replied. "I don't have the authority to override a judicial decision." Dr. Wilson stepped forward, his face grim with determination. "Then perhaps it's time someone spoke to Judge Patterson directly. I have medical evidence that proves this child has been systematically tortured. Any judge who would ignore that evidence is either corrupt or incompetent." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. To directly challenge a judge's integrity was a serious matter, one that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Clara seized on the moment of uncertainty. "Sheriff, I demand that you carry out your legal duty. This mob has no right to interfere with the proper functioning of justice." But as she spoke, Reed noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. 3 more of Cooper's men had arrived, positioning themselves strategically around the gathering. They weren't making any threatening moves, but their presence was unmistakable. "Dr. Wilson," Reed said quietly, I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't just about legal custody anymore. Wilson followed Reed's gaze and saw the armed men taking positions. His face went pale as he realized the implications. You think they'd resort to violence? I think Clara has too much to lose to let Emma testify against her in a public hearing, and Cooper has too much invested in Clara's reputation to let it be destroyed. Emma had noticed the tension as well, and she pressed closer to Reed's side. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Nothing you need to worry about," Reed said, but his hand was already moving toward his gun. "Just stay close to me." The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Clara demanding compliance with the court order, while Wilson and Reverend Benjamin argued for Emma's protection. But Reed could see that the real decision was being made by the armed men surrounding them, not by the legal authorities. Finally, Cooper's driver stepped forward and spoke quietly to Sheriff Holden. Reed couldn't hear the words, but he could see Holden's face growing increasingly pale as he listened. "I'm sorry," Holden said, finally his voice barely above a whisper, "but I have no choice. The child has to come with us." Reed felt Emma's hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently. "Remember what I told you," he said softly. "No matter what happens, I will find you." But as Holden approached them, Reed made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of surrendering Emma, he stepped protectively in front of her and drew his gun in one smooth motion. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," he said calmly, "but I can't let you do this." The effect was immediate and electric. Several people in the crowd screamed and dove for cover, while Cooper's men reached for their weapons. But Reed's gun was already trained on Clara, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced death many times before. "Mrs. Stanton, you're going to walk away from here, and you're never going to come near Emma again." Clara's face was twisted with rage and disbelief. "You can't threaten me, Sheriff. Arrest this madman." But Holden was frozen in place, his hand hovering over his own weapon, but not quite willing to draw it. Reed's reputation as a gunfighter had preceded him to redemption, and the sheriff was not eager to test his skills against a man who had survived the war and 2 decades on the frontier. "Reed," Dr. Wilson said, urgently, "this isn't the way. You're making yourself an outlaw." "I was already an outlaw the moment I chose to protect an innocent child over following corrupt laws," Reed replied. "Emma, get behind me and stay low." Cooper's men were starting to spread out, trying to get better positions for a fight, but Reed had fought in enough battles to recognize their tactics, and he knew that once the shooting started, innocent people would die. "Wait," Emma said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Wait, everybody, just wait." To Reed's amazement, the child stepped out from behind him and faced the crowd with remarkable composure. Despite her fear, she held herself with a dignity that reminded him powerfully of her father. "I have something to say," she announced, her young voice carrying clearly across the frozen yard, "and I want everyone to hear it." Clara started to object, but Reverend Benjamin held up a hand for silence. "Let the child speak," he said firmly. Emma took a deep breath and began to tell her story, not the abbreviated version she had shared with Reed and Dr. Wilson, but the full horrible truth of her months under Clara's care. She spoke of the beatings and the starvation of being locked in the cold cellar for days at a time, of the bitter medicine that made her violently ill. But more than that, she spoke of the other children who had come before her, the girls who had died under mysterious circumstances whose names Clara had used to torment her during the worst of her punishments. "She told me about Margaret," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, "how Margaret got sick and died because she was weak and worthless, and about Sarah who tried to run away and was found frozen in the mountains, and about little Beth who had an accident and fell down the stairs." The crowd was listening in horrified silence as Emma continued her testimony. Each detail she provided painted a clearer picture of systematic murder disguised as unfortunate accidents. "She said I would end up just like them if I didn't learn to be grateful for her kindness," Emma concluded. "And I believed her until Mr. Reed showed me that there were still good people in the world who would fight for what's right." When she finished speaking, the silence was deafening. Even Cooper's men seemed shaken by the child's testimony, and several of them were exchanging uncertain glances. Clara was staring at Emma with undisguised hatred, all pretense of maternal concern abandoned. "You lying little witch," she snarled. "After everything I've done for you, everything you've done to her," Reed corrected, his gun still trained on Clara's chest. and to the other children who trusted you." Reverend Benjamin stepped forward, his face grave with righteous anger. "Mrs. Stanton," he said, his voice carrying the authority of moral conviction, "if even half of what this child says is true, then you are a monster who is hidden behind the mask of Christian charity while committing the most heinous crimes imaginable." "These are all lies," Clara protested, but her voice lacked conviction now. "Fabrications designed to destroy an innocent woman's reputation." Dr. Wilson opened his medical bag again and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been investigating the deaths of those other children," he said grimly, "and I've found some very disturbing patterns in their medical records." He began reading from his notes detailing the suspicious circumstances surrounding each death. Margaret had died of what was diagnosed as pneumonia, but her symptoms were more consistent with arsenic poisoning. Sarah had indeed been found frozen, but she had injuries suggesting she had been beaten before being left to die in the cold. And little Beth's accidental fall had resulted in injuries that suggested she had been pushed. 3 children dead in 5 years, Wilson concluded, all under the care of the same woman, all under suspicious circumstances. And now we find a 4th child showing clear signs of the same abuse that killed the others. The weight of evidence was becoming overwhelming, and Reed could see the crowd's mood shifting from uncertainty to outright hostility toward Clara. But he also noticed that Cooper's men were becoming increasingly agitated, clearly realizing that their employer's investment was about to become a public relations disaster. "This is all very interesting," Cooper's driver said suddenly, his hand resting on his gun butt, "but we have our orders. The child comes with us one way or another." Reed's eyes narrowed as he recognized the threat. "And I have my principles. Emma stays with me." The standoff was reaching a breaking point, and Reed could feel the tension building toward violence. But before anyone could draw a weapon, an unexpected voice cut through the crowd. "What in the name of Sam Hill is going on here?" Everyone turned to see a tall, lean man in a badge and long coat striding through the crowd. Reed didn't recognize him, but from the way Cooper's men immediately stiffened, he was clearly someone with significant authority. "Marshal Kane," Sheriff Holden said with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here." U.S. Marshal William Kane was a legend throughout Wyoming territory, known for his incorruptible honesty and his willingness to take on powerful interests when justice demanded it. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and steely blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Sheriff Holden," Kane said curtly, "I received some very disturbing reports about child abuse and possible murder in your jurisdiction. I came to investigate for myself." Reed felt a surge of hope as he realized that help had arrived from an unexpected quarter, but he kept his gun trained on Clara, knowing that desperate people were capable of desperate acts. Kane's eyes swept over the scene, taking in Reed's drawn weapon, Emma's obvious distress, and the tension crackling between the various factions. Would someone like to explain why there are guns being pointed at civilians? "Marshal," Clara said quickly, stepping forward with her most charming smile. "This man has kidnapped my legal ward and is threatening innocent people. I demand that you arrest him immediately." Kane studied Clara for a long moment, then turned his attention to Emma. The child met his gaze steadily, and Reed could see the marshal's expression soften slightly as he took in her obvious malnutrition and visible injuries. "And you, young lady," Kane said gently, "what's your side of this story?" Emma looked at Reed, who nodded encouragingly. Then she began to tell her story again, this time to someone who clearly had the authority to act on what he heard. Kane listened without interruption, his face growing progressively grimmer as Emma detailed the abuse she had suffered. When she finished, he turned to Dr. Wilson. "Doctor, I assume you have medical evidence to support these allegations." Wilson handed over his folder of photographs and medical records. Kane studied them carefully, his jaw tightening as he saw the extent of Emma's injuries. "Mrs. Stanton," he said finally, his voice carrying the cold authority of federal law enforcement, "you are under arrest for child abuse, child endangerment, and suspicion of murder." Clara's face went white with shock and rage. "You can't arrest me. I have powerful friends connections all the way to Washington. Judge Patterson himself issued the custody order. Judge Patterson," Kane said grimly, "is currently under investigation by my office for taking bribes and perverting the course of justice. His orders carry no weight with me." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Judge Patterson had been considered above reproach, and the idea that he was corrupt shook everyone's understanding of their local justice system. Cooper's driver started to step forward, but Kane's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease. "I wouldn't if I were you. Interfering with a federal arrest is a serious crime." "Marshal," the man said carefully, "Mr. Cooper has significant business interests in this territory. He wouldn't want those interests to be compromised by any misunderstandings." Kane's smile was cold as winter steel. "Mr. Cooper's business interests include profiting from the abuse and murder of children. I'm sure a jury will find that very interesting." Reed could see the moment when Cooper's men realized that their employer had abandoned them to save himself. Without Cooper's backing, they were just hired guns facing a federal marshal with an unimpeachable reputation. "Drop your weapons," Kane ordered, and after a moment's hesitation they complied. As Kane's deputy marshals, who had apparently been waiting nearby, moved in to arrest Clara and Cooper's men. Reed finally lowered his own gun. Emma immediately ran to his side, throwing her arms around his waist with desperate relief. "It's over," Reed said softly, stroking her hair. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Reed knew they weren't entirely true. Clara and Judge Patterson might be under arrest, but Cooper himself was still free, and men with his kind of power and resources didn't give up easily. The immediate danger had passed, but the war for Emma's freedom was far from over. Marshal Kane approached them as his deputies led Clara away in chains. The woman was no longer the poised society matron who had terrorized Emma. She was a broken, raging criminal whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled completely. "Mr. Maddox," Kane said, extending his hand, "I want to thank you for protecting this child. Your actions probably saved her life." Reed shook the marshal's hand, but his expression remained troubled. "What happens now, Cooper is still out there and he has the resources to cause a lot of trouble." "Mr. Cooper," Kane said grimly, "is about to discover that federal law enforcement has a very long reach. We've been building a case against him for months, and Mrs. Stanton's crimes are just one piece of a much larger puzzle." Emma looked up at Kane with wonder. "Does this mean I don't have to go back to her?" "You never have to see Mrs. Stanton again," Kane assured her, "but we'll need to figure out proper custody arrangements for you." Reed felt his heart clench at the thought of losing Emma after everything they had been through together, but before he could speak, Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "Marshal, if I may suggest, Mr. Maddox has clearly demonstrated his commitment to this child's welfare, and given the trauma she's experienced, it might be best to leave her in a stable environment where she feels safe." Kane studied Reed carefully, clearly evaluating him as a potential guardian. "Tell me about your relationship to the child, Mr. Maddox." Reed explained about his friendship with James Lark and the deathbed promise he had made. As he spoke, Kane's expression grew more thoughtful. "A soldier's oath," the marshal mused. "That's not something to be taken lightly." "No, sir," Reed agreed. "It's not." Kane was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma as she clung to Reed's side. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "I'll speak to the territorial authorities about arranging permanent custody," he said. "Given the circumstances and your obvious dedication to the child's welfare, I don't think there will be any objections." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Reed found himself thinking about how dramatically their lives had changed in just a few short hours. They had gone from desperate fugitives to having the protection of federal law enforcement, and Emma was finally safe from Clara's threats. But Reed also knew that their story was far from over. Clara might be in custody, but her crimes had revealed a network of corruption that reached deep into the territory's power structure. And somewhere out there, Hank Cooper was undoubtedly planning his next move. For now, though, Emma was safe, and that was what mattered most. As they walked back toward his cabin through the falling snow, Reed felt a sense of cautious optimism for the first time since this ordeal had begun. "Mr. Reed," Emma said quietly, "what you did today, drawing your gun to protect me, that was very dangerous." "Yes," Reed agreed. "It was. My father would have done the same thing, wouldn't he?" Reed smiled down at her, seeing so much of James in her brave spirit and unwavering moral compass. "Yes, Emma, your father would have done exactly the same thing." As they reached the cabin, Reed realized that the hardest part of their journey might still lie ahead. Clara's arrest was just the beginning of a legal process that could take months to resolve, and Cooper's influence might still cause problems for them. But for the first time since he had made his promise to James Lark, Reed felt like he was truly succeeding in keeping his word. Emma was alive. She was safe, and she was beginning to heal from the trauma that had nearly destroyed her. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would face it together, bound by ties stronger than blood and united by a shared commitment to justice and truth. Outside, the Wyoming winter continued its relentless assault. But inside Reed's cabin, warmth and hope were beginning to grow again, nurtured by the unbreakable bond between a man keeping a sacred promise and the child whose courage had finally brought her tormentor to justice. The battle was won, but the war for Emma's future and for justice against those who would prey upon the innocent was just beginning to reach its climax. Reed discovered this harsh truth 3 nights after Clara's arrest, when the sound of splintering wood and breaking glass shattered the peaceful silence of his cabin. He bolted upright from his chair by the fire where he'd been dozing while Emma slept safely in his bed. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see dark figures moving stealthily around the perimeter of his property, their shapes barely visible against the snow-covered landscape. "Emma," he whispered urgently, shaking her gently awake. "We need to go. Now." She came awake instantly, the survival instincts honed by months of abuse serving her well. Without a word, she rolled out of bed and began pulling on her clothes with practiced efficiency. Reed moved to the window and peered out cautiously. He counted at least 6 men, all armed and moving with the coordinated precision of professional killers. Cooper had clearly decided that subtle legal maneuvering wasn't enough. He was escalating to direct violence. "Mr. Reed?" Emma whispered, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "Are they here for me? They're here for both of us," Reed replied grimly, checking his rifle and pistol. "Cooper can't afford to let us testify against Clara. Too many of his secrets would come out." A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and calm, despite the circumstances. "Mr. Maddox, this is Hank Cooper. I believe we need to have a conversation." Reed's blood ran cold as he realized Cooper had come personally to oversee their elimination. The man's presence meant this wasn't just about silencing witnesses. It was about sending a message to anyone else who might consider challenging his empire. "I have nothing to say to you, Cooper," Reed called back, positioning himself where he could cover both the front and back entrances to the cabin. "I think you'll find my offer very reasonable," Cooper continued, his voice carrying easily across the frozen yard. "A quick death for both of you in exchange for my guarantee that no other children will suffer the fate that befell Clara's previous wards." Emma gasped softly at the casual admission of Clara's crimes, and Reed felt his anger flare white-hot. Cooper was treating the murder of innocent children as nothing more than a business transaction gone wrong. "Counteroffer," Reed shouted back. "You and your men ride away now, and I won't kill every last one of you." Cooper's laughter was like ice crackling in the winter air. "Mr. Maddox, you're outnumbered 6-1. Even a man of your reputation can't overcome those odds." Reed was thinking furiously, trying to find a way out of their desperate situation. The cabin was well built, but not designed to withstand a sustained assault by armed professionals. Their only advantages were Reed's superior knowledge of the local terrain and the fact that Cooper's men would be cautious about damaging the building, some 4 confirming their targets were inside. "Emma," he said quietly, "do you remember the old mine shaft I showed you yesterday? The one about a 1/4 mile north of here?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "I want you to slip out the back window and make your way there. Stay low, use the trees for cover, and whatever happens, don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination he'd seen in her father. "Emma, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." Her voice was quiet but filled with steel. "You promised my father you'd protect me, and you have. But I'm not going to let you die keeping that promise. We go together, or we don't go at all." Reed stared at her in amazement, seeing not the terrified child who had fled Clara's house, but a young woman of remarkable courage and conviction. In that moment, he understood that Emma had inherited more than just her father's eyes. She had inherited his unshakable moral code. "All right," he said, making a decision that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. "We go together, but you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Understood? Understood." Reed quickly gathered their essential supplies, ammunition, food, warm clothes, and the legal documents that proved Emma's identity and his guardianship rights. If they survived the next few hours, they would need those papers to establish their legitimate status with the territorial authorities. Cooper's voice rang out again, closer now. "Mr. Maddox, I'm losing patience. You have 60 seconds to come out voluntarily, or my men will come in and get you." Reed knew Cooper wasn't bluffing. The man had too much invested in this outcome to accept failure, and his reputation for ruthlessness was well established throughout the territory. "The back window," Reed whispered to Emma. "On my signal, you go first. I'll be right behind you." He moved to the front of the cabin and fired a shot through the window, not aiming to hit anyone but to create confusion and buy them precious seconds. The response was immediate gunfire, erupted from multiple positions around the cabin, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass. "Now!" Reed hissed. Emma slipped through the back window with cat-like grace, landing silently in the snow. Reed followed, pulling the window closed behind them just as Cooper's men began their assault on the front door. They moved quickly through the darkness, using the storm that had begun to intensify as cover. The wind was howling now, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere yards. It was dangerous weather to be traveling in, but it might also save their lives. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood announced that Cooper's men had broken into the cabin. Reed could hear shouting and cursing as they discovered their quarry had escaped, followed by Cooper's voice raised in furious command. "Find them, they can't have gone far in this weather." Reed and Emma pressed on through the deepening snow, following a game trail that wound through the pine forest north of town. Reed's knowledge of the local terrain was serving them well. He knew every ridge, every gully, every possible hiding place within a 10-mile radius. But Cooper's men knew their business too. Within minutes, Reed could hear them spreading out in a coordinated search pattern, their voices calling to each other through the storm. They had lanterns and dogs, and they were methodically checking every possible escape route. "This way," Reed whispered, leading Emma off the main trail toward a steep ravine that would be treacherous to navigate in the dark, but would also be the last place their pursuers would expect them to go. They half slid, half climbed down the rocky slope, Emma following Reed's movements with the sure-footed precision of someone who had learned to move silently during her months of abuse. The sound of their passage was masked by the howling wind and the crash of snow falling from overloaded tree branches. At the bottom of the ravine, Reed paused to get his bearings. The old mine shaft was still at least a mile away, and the terrain between here and there was some of the most difficult in the area. But it was also the most likely to shake their pursuit. "How are you holding up?" he asked Emma quietly. "I'm fine," she replied, though he could see she was already showing signs of exhaustion. The cold was brutal, and despite the warm clothes Reed had insisted she wear, she was still dangerously thin and weakened by her ordeal. "The mine isn't much farther," Reed lied, hoping to keep her spirits up. "We'll be safe there." They pressed on through the storm, following the frozen creek bed that ran along the bottom of the ravine. The going was treacherous. Ice-covered rocks and fallen logs created a maze of obstacles that had to be navigated carefully in the darkness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter, but had not disappeared entirely. Cooper was clearly determined to finish what he had started regardless of the danger to his own men. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a point where the ravine branched into two smaller gullies. Reed chose the left fork, knowing it would eventually lead them to higher ground and the concealed entrance to the abandoned mine. But as they climbed out of the creek bed, Reed heard something that made his blood run cold, the baying of hunting dogs getting closer despite the storm. "They have our scent," he said grimly. "We need to move faster." Emma nodded and pushed herself harder, though Reed could see she was reaching the limits of her endurance. The combination of cold exhaustion and residual weakness from her abuse was taking its toll. They emerged from the ravine into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The wind was somewhat less fierce here, but the snow was falling even more heavily, creating a wall of white that limited visibility to mere feet. Reed was getting his bearings when he heard the snap of a breaking branch behind them. He spun around, his rifle ready, just as 3 of Cooper's men emerged from the tree line with their guns drawn. "End of the line, Maddox," the lead gunman called out. "Mr. Cooper wants this finished tonight." Reed positioned himself protectively in front of Emma, his weapon trained on the closest threat. 3 against 1. Those aren't very sporting odds. "Should have thought of that before you crossed Hank Cooper," the man replied. "Now step aside and let us take the girl. Make this easy on yourself." Not going to happen. Reed could see the other 2 gunmen moving to flank them, trying to get better angles for a clear shot. Emma pressed close behind him, and he could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Reed knew his chances were poor. Even if he could take down one or two of them, the third would almost certainly kill him and Emma. But sometimes in the most desperate moments, unexpected allies appeared. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air, and one of Cooper's men spun around and fell into the snow. The other two whirled toward the sound, giving Reed the opening he needed. He dropped the closest gunman with a single shot, then dove sideways as the third man's bullet whistled past his head. Emma scrambled behind a fallen log as more shots rang out from the darkness. Someone else was in the fight now, and they were on Reed's side. The remaining gunmen tried to retreat but ran directly into the path of their unknown ally. Another rifle shot echoed through the forest, and Cooper's last man dropped without a sound. "Reed, Emma. Are you all right?" The voice that called out was familiar, and Reed felt a surge of relief as Dr. Wilson emerged from the trees, his medical bag slung over one shoulder and a hunting rifle in his hands. "Doc," Reed called out, "what are you doing here?" "Marshal Kane got word that Cooper was planning something," Wilson replied, hurrying toward them. "He sent me to warn you, but it looks like I'm a little late for that." Emma ran to the doctor, throwing her arms around him with desperate relief. "Dr. Wilson, how did you find us?" "I know these mountains as well as Reed does," Wilson said, returning her embrace. "I've been treating miners and trappers up here for 20 years. When I heard the shooting, I followed the sound." Reed was scanning the surrounding forest, listening for signs of other pursuers. "We need to keep moving. Cooper had at least 6 men with him, and we've only accounted for 3. "Actually," Wilson said grimly, "we've accounted for 5. I ran into 2 more on my way up here. They won't be bothering anyone again." The implications of Wilson's words were clear. The gentle doctor had been forced to kill to protect them. Reed could see the strain in the older man's face, the weight of taking lives even in self-defense. "That leaves Cooper himself," Reed said, "and he's the most dangerous of all." As if summoned by his words, Cooper's voice echoed through the storm from somewhere nearby. "Very impressive, gentlemen. But this isn't over, not by a long shot." The 3 of them moved instinctively into a defensive position, weapons ready. Emma stayed close to Reed, her young face grim with determination. "You're finished, Cooper," Reed called out. "Your men are dead, and Marshal Kane knows what you've been doing. Give it up." Cooper's laughter drifted through the swirling snow. "Marshal Kane is 50 miles away, dealing with a convenient emergency that required his immediate attention. By the time he returns, this unfortunate incident will be ancient history." Reed felt his heart sink as he realized the full scope of Cooper's planning. The man had orchestrated Kane's absence, probably through false reports of trouble elsewhere in his jurisdiction. They were truly on their own. "Here's what's going to happen," Cooper continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're all going to die in this storm, tragic victims of the harsh Wyoming winter. The girl will be found weeks from now, if at all. A cautionary tale about what happens to children who run away from their proper guardians." Emma stepped forward, her young voice carrying clearly through the wind. "You're wrong, Mr. Cooper. People know the truth now. They've seen the evidence. Even if you kill us, Clara's crimes will still come to light." "Clara is a convenient scapegoat," Cooper replied dismissively. "A disturbed woman who snapped under the pressure of caring for difficult children. Her testimony will be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman, especially after she suffers a tragic accident in her cell." The casual way Cooper discussed murdering Clara chilled Reed to the bone. The man was tying up all loose ends, eliminating anyone who could connect him to the systematic abuse and murder of children. Dr. Wilson had been listening to the exchange with growing horror. "My God," he whispered, "he's planning to kill Clara too." "She's already dead," Cooper said, apparently having heard Wilson's comment. "Amazing how often prisoners in territorial jails suffer fatal accidents. Falls downstairs mostly. Very unfortunate." Emma let out a small gasp of shock, and Reed felt his rage building to a white-hot intensity. Clara had been a monster, but she was also the only living witness to Cooper's involvement in her crimes. Her death would effectively bury the truth forever. "You see," Cooper continued, "I've spent years building my empire in this territory. I own judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, anyone who matters. A few dead children and their protectors are simply the cost of doing business." Reed was trying to pinpoint Cooper's location by the sound of his voice, but the man was clearly moving using the storm as cover while he maneuvered for the best shot. "The mine," Reed whispered to Wilson and Emma. "It's our only chance, if we can get to cover." Wilson nodded understanding immediately. The abandoned mine shaft would provide protection from both the weather and Cooper's gun, and it had multiple entrances that would make it difficult for one man to trap them inside. They began moving carefully through the trees, using the largest trunks as cover while they worked their way toward higher ground. The snow was falling so heavily now that they could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. But Cooper was an experienced hunter, and he had read their intentions correctly. As they reached the edge of another small clearing, his voice rang out directly ahead of them. "I wouldn't go any farther if I were you." They froze, weapons ready, but unable to see their target through the swirling snow. Reed could feel Emma pressed against his back, her breathing quick and shallow with fear. "You know," Cooper said conversationally, "I actually admire your determination, Mr. Maddox. It's a shame you chose the wrong side in this fight. We could have been allies." "I could never be allies with someone who profits from the murder of children," Reed replied. "Children die every day on the frontier," Cooper said with chilling indifference. "Disease accidents, Indian raids, what difference does it make how they meet their end?" At least Clara's method served a useful purpose. What purpose could possibly justify torturing innocent children? "Control," Cooper said simply. "Fear is the most powerful tool of governance ever devised. When people know that even children aren't safe from those in power, they become much more compliant." The naked evil in Cooper's words left Reed speechless. This wasn't just about money or business interests, it was about the systematic use of terror to maintain absolute control over the territory's population. Dr. Wilson found his voice first. "You're insane," he said quietly. "You're talking about institutionalized murder as a tool of political control." "I'm talking about reality," Cooper replied. "The strong rule, the weak and the weak learn to accept their place. Clara's little hobby served my larger purposes perfectly until this interfering soldier decided to play hero." Emma stepped forward again, her young voice ringing with moral authority. "My father was a hero, a real hero who died fighting for what was right. You're just a coward who hides behind money and power." The silence that followed her words was deafening. When Cooper spoke again, his voice had lost its conversational tone and taken on a deadly edge. "Your father was a fool who died for nothing, just like you're about to do." The shot came from directly ahead of them, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating Cooper's position behind a large boulder. Reed dove sideways, pushing Emma to the ground as the bullet whistled past them. Dr. Wilson returned fire immediately, his shot chipping stone from Cooper's cover. The rancher ducked back, then began moving again, trying to circle around for a better angle. "Stay low," Reed commanded Emma, then began stalking Cooper through the storm. His years of military experience were serving him well. He could read the subtle signs of movement, even in the swirling snow. Cooper was good, but Reed had fought against some of the best marksmen in the Confederate Army and survived. He used every available piece of cover, moving in short bursts that made him difficult to track. The hunt continued for several minutes, with both men trying to outmaneuver the other in the treacherous terrain. Dr. Wilson stayed with Emma, protecting her while contributing what covering fire he could. Finally, Reed spotted Cooper moving between two trees about 30 yards away. He lined up his shot carefully, accounting for wind and distance, then squeezed the trigger. The bullet took Cooper in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the snow. He stumbled, went down on one knee, then reached for a pistol with his good hand. Reed was already moving, closing the distance before Cooper could bring his weapon to bear. The two men crashed together in the snow, fighting desperately for control of Cooper's gun. Despite his wound, Cooper was strong and determined. He managed to get his hand on Reed's throat, squeezing with murderous intent while trying to bring his pistol around. But Reed had fought in too many desperate battles to be defeated by a wounded businessman. He broke Cooper's grip with a savage elbow strike, then grabbed the man's gun hand and twisted until he heard bones crack. Cooper screamed and released the weapon, which disappeared into the deep snow. Reed rolled away and came up with his own pistol trained on Cooper's chest. "It's over," Reed said, breathing heavily from the exertion. Cooper lay in the snow, clutching his broken wrist while blood seeped through his coat from the shoulder wound. His face was twisted with rage and pain, but his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him so dangerous. "You think you've won?" he gasped. But I still have friends in high places, judges, politicians, businessmen who depend on my empire for their prosperity. They'll never let you destroy what I've built." Dr. Wilson and Emma had approached carefully, their weapons still ready in case Cooper had any more surprises. Emma stared down at the man who had terrorized her, and so many others, her young face grave with understanding. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but people know the truth now, and sometimes that's enough." Reed was binding Cooper's wounds with strips torn from the man's own expensive coat when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders were coming through the storm, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. "Reed, Emma, where are you?" The voice that called out was Marshal Kane's, and Reed felt a surge of relief. Somehow the federal lawman had escaped Cooper's trap and arrived just in time. "Over here, Marshal," Reed called back. Kane appeared through the snow with a squad of deputy marshals, all heavily armed and clearly prepared for a fight. His face was grim as he took in the scene, Cooper wounded and helpless in the snow, Reed and his companions standing over him with drawn weapons. "Mr. Cooper," Kane said with cold satisfaction, "I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time." Cooper's face had gone pale, whether from blood loss or the realization that his empire was finally crumbling. "Marshal Kane," he said weakly, "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Kane replied, "was thinking you could murder federal witnesses and get away with it. You're under arrest for conspiracy murder and about a dozen other federal crimes." As Kane's deputies moved in to secure Cooper, the marshal turned to Reed with an expression of profound gratitude. "I got your message just in time. If Dr. Wilson hadn't found me—" "What message?" Reed asked, confused. Kane looked equally puzzled, then turned to Emma. "The young lady here sent word through one of the town children that Cooper was planning to attack you tonight. She managed to get the warning to me just as I was leaving for what turned out to be a wild goose chase 50 miles north of here." Reed stared at Emma in amazement. "When did you do that?" Emma's cheeks reddened slightly. "Yesterday, when you sent me to the general store for supplies, I saw some of Cooper's men watching the marshal's office, and I had a feeling something bad was going to happen. So I told Tommy Morrison to tell Marshal Kane that Mr. Cooper was planning to hurt us." Reed shook his head in wonder. Emma's quick thinking and courage had quite possibly saved all their lives. She had inherited more than just her father's eyes and stubbornness. She had inherited his tactical intelligence and ability to think clearly under pressure. "Your father would be very proud of you," Reed told her softly. As Kane's men prepared to transport Cooper back to town for medical treatment and eventual trial, the marshal took Reed aside for a private conversation. "This is bigger than just Cooper," Kane said quietly. "We've been investigating a network of corruption that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Cooper was a major player, but he wasn't the only one." "What does that mean for Emma's custody case?" "It means you'll have full legal guardianship within the week," Kane replied. "Judge Patterson confessed to taking bribes before he had his accident. Apparently he fell down the stairs in his cell just like Cooper predicted Clara would." Reed felt a chill at the implication. Even from jail, Cooper's influence had been sufficient to silence potential witnesses. If Kane hadn't arrived when he did, the entire conspiracy might have been buried along with its victims. "Will Emma be safe now?" Kane was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "Cooper's network is extensive, and desperate people do desperate things. I'd recommend leaving the territory for a while, at least until we've rolled up the rest of his organization." Reed nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. Wyoming territory held too many bad memories for Emma, and too many enemies who might seek revenge for Cooper's downfall. As they made their way back toward town, through the gradually clearing storm, Reed found himself thinking about the future for the first time in months. The immediate crisis was over, but Emma would need time to heal from her trauma. She would need education, stability, and the chance to grow up in a place where her past couldn't follow her. "Mr. Reed," Emma said quietly, walking beside him through the snow. "What happens now?" Reed looked down at her, this brave, remarkable child who had survived horrors that would have broken many adults. She was looking at him with trust and hope, waiting for him to provide the answers that would shape the rest of her life. "Now," he said, "we go somewhere safe. Somewhere you can be a normal child for a while. Maybe Oregon Territory or California. Somewhere far away from all of this." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of leaving the only home she had ever known. "Will you stay with me?" "For as long as you want me to," Reed promised. "I made an oath to your father and I intend to keep it. You're my responsibility now, Emma, my family." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Emma had been alone for so long without anyone to truly care for her welfare. And Reed had been drifting for years without purpose or direction since the war ended. "Family," Emma repeated softly, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." As they approached the outskirts of Redemption, Reed could see the lights of the town twinkling through the clearing storm. Soon they would need to make arrangements for their departure, gathering supplies, securing transportation, and putting this chapter of their lives behind them. But first, there was one more thing Reed needed to do. When they reached his cabin, he went to his trunk and pulled out a small wooden box that he had carried with him for more than 20 years. Inside the box were his most precious possessions, medals from the war letters from fallen comrades, and a photograph of James Lark taken just days before the battle that claimed his life. Reed handed the photograph to Emma, who studied it with wonder. "He looks so young," she said softly. "He was young," Reed replied. "But he had the courage of someone twice his age, just like his daughter." Emma looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for keeping your promise to him and for saving me." Reed gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the last of the storm winds died away outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new journeys, but tonight they were safe, warm, and finally free from the shadows that had haunted them both for so long. The promise made to a dying soldier had finally been fulfilled, but Reed realized it had become something more than duty. Emma was no longer just James Lark's daughter. She was his daughter now in every way that mattered, and he would protect her, guide her, and love her for the rest of his days. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear through the breaking clouds, shining down on a territory that was slowly being freed from the corruption and evil that had held it in darkness for too long. Justice had finally triumphed, and innocent blood had been avenged. The war was over, and they had won. The war was over, and they had won. But as Reed discovered in the weeks that followed, victory often came with a price that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The legal proceedings that unfolded in the territorial capital revealed a web of corruption so extensive that it shook the very foundations of Wyoming's power structure. 3 weeks after Cooper's arrest, Reed and Emma found themselves in the imposing courtroom of Judge Samuel Patterson's replacement, a stern federal magistrate named Judge Morrison, who had been sent from Denver specifically to oversee the trials that would determine their fate. The room was packed with spectators, reporters, and officials who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Emma sat beside Reed in the front row, her small hand clasped tightly in his as they waited for the proceedings to begin. She had grown stronger in the weeks since their ordeal, both physically and emotionally, but Reed could still see traces of the trauma she had endured in the way she startled at sudden noises and instinctively moved closer to him whenever strangers approached. Dr. Wilson sat on Emma's other side, his medical bag at his feet and a thick folder of evidence in his lap. The gentle physician had become more than just Emma's doctor. He had become a friend and ally whose testimony would be crucial to ensuring that justice was finally served. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom erupted in a rustle of movement as everyone stood. Judge Morrison was a tall, lean man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had spent 30 years on the federal bench and had a reputation for absolute incorruptibility, exactly the kind of man needed to clean up the mess that Cooper and his associates had created. "Be seated," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily through the large room. "We are here today to address the petition for permanent custody of Miss Emma Lark, as well as to hear evidence regarding the criminal conspiracy that has been uncovered in this territory." Reed felt Emma's hand tighten in his as the judge spoke. Despite Marshal Kane's assurances, there was still a possibility that some technicality or political maneuvering could separate them. The legal system that had failed Emma before might fail her again. "Before we proceed," Judge Morrison continued, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This court will not be swayed by political considerations, financial interests, or social connections. We are here to serve justice and to protect the welfare of an innocent child who has suffered far too much already. The judge's words sent a murmur through the courtroom, and Reed saw several well-dressed men in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. These were Cooper's remaining allies, businessmen and politicians who had profited from his empire and were now desperately trying to distance themselves from his crimes. The first witness called was Marshal Kane, who provided a detailed account of the investigation that had led to Cooper's arrest. His testimony painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into every level of territorial government. Mr. Cooper operated what can only be described as a criminal empire. Kane said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in federal law enforcement. He owned judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, and business leaders. Anyone who opposed him was either bought off, intimidated, or eliminated. And what role did Mrs. Clara Stanton play in this conspiracy? Judge Morrison asked. Mrs. Stanton served multiple purposes, Kane replied. Her boarding house was used to launder money and house Cooper's associates, but more significantly, her systematic abuse and murder of children served as a warning to the community about what happened to those who crossed Cooper's organization. Emma shuddered at Kane's words, and Reed put his arm around her shoulders protectively. Even though Clara was dead and Cooper was in custody, the scope of their evil was still difficult to comprehend. The marshal continued his testimony for over an hour, detailing the evidence that had been gathered against Cooper's network. Bank records showed massive transfers of illegal funds, witness statements revealed a pattern of intimidation and violence, and medical records documented the deaths of at least 7 children under suspicious circumstances. When Kane finished, Dr. Wilson was called to the stand. The physician's testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. He presented photographs of Emma's injuries, medical records of the other children who had died in Clara's care, and expert analysis that left no doubt about the systematic nature of the abuse. In my professional opinion, Wilson concluded, Emma Lark was being slowly murdered through a combination of physical abuse, psychological torture, and deliberate poisoning. If Mr. Maddox had not intervened when he did, she would have died within weeks. Judge Morrison studied the photographs that had been entered into evidence, his face growing progressively grimmer as he saw the extent of Emma's suffering. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with righteous anger. Dr. Wilson, the judge said, in your medical opinion, what kind of long-term care will Miss Lark require to recover from this trauma? She needs stability, safety, and the love of someone who genuinely cares for her welfare, Wilson replied. She's already made remarkable progress under Mr. Maddox's care, but full recovery will take years of patient, consistent support. And do you believe Mr. Maddox is capable of providing that support? Wilson turned to look at Reed and Emma, his eyes warm with affection and respect. Your Honor, I have watched Reed Maddox risk his life repeatedly to protect this child. He has shown more dedication to her welfare than most biological parents show to their own children. Emma needs him and he needs her. They've become a family in the truest sense of the word. The judge nodded thoughtfully, then called for a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Reed remained seated with Emma and Dr. Wilson, all of them lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. Mr. Reed, Emma said quietly, what happens if the judge decides I should go to another family, a more normal family? Reed knelt down so he could look directly into her eyes. Emma, I want you to understand something. You are my family now in every way that matters. I made a promise to your father, but this stopped being about duty a long time ago. I love you like you were my own daughter, and I will fight for you with everything I have. Tears began to stream down Emma's face, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than fear. I love you too, Mr. Reed. You're the father I never thought I'd have. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison called Emma to the witness stand. Reed felt his heart clench as she walked across the courtroom looking impossibly small in the imposing surroundings. But when she took the oath and settled into the witness chair, her voice was clear and strong. Miss Lark, Judge Morrison said gently, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me about your experiences with Mrs. Stanton. Emma took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She spoke of the beatings, the starvation, the poisonous medicine, and the constant terror that had defined her life under Clara's care. But she also spoke of the other children who had suffered before her, and her determination to ensure that no other child would endure what she had experienced. "Mrs. Stanton used to tell me about the girls who came before me," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "She said they were weak and worthless and that's why they died. But I know now that they weren't weak. They were murdered. And if I hadn't escaped, I would have been murdered too." Judge Morrison listened to every word, occasionally asking gentle questions to clarify details. When Emma finished her testimony, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of several people weeping quietly. "Miss Lark," the judge said softly, "you have shown remarkable courage in sharing your story. But I need to ask you one more question. Where would you like to live? Who would you like to have as your guardian?" Emma didn't hesitate. "I want to stay with Mr. Reed," she said firmly. "He saved my life and he's the only person who's ever made me feel safe. He promised my father he would take care of me, and he's kept that promise every single day." The judge nodded and dismissed Emma from the stand. As she returned to her seat beside Reed, he could see the exhaustion in her face but also a sense of relief. She had told her truth, and now it was up to the legal system to decide their fate. The final witness was Reed himself. As he took the stand, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Everything that mattered to him, Emma's future, their life together, the fulfillment of his promise to James depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Judge Morrison studied Reed carefully before beginning his questioning. "Mr. Maddox, tell me about your relationship with James Lark and the promise you made to him." Reed spoke about his friendship with James, the battle that claimed his life, and the deathbed oath that had driven Reed's actions for more than 20 years. He explained how he had searched for Emma and Sarah and how fate had finally brought him to redemption just in time to save Emma from Clara's clutches. "Your Honor," Reed said, his voice filled with emotion, "I failed to keep my promise for many years. I couldn't find Emma and her mother when they needed me most. But I have her now, and I swear on James Lark's grave that I will never fail her again." "Mr. Maddox," the judge said, "caring for a traumatized child is an enormous responsibility. Are you prepared for the challenges that lie ahead?" "I am, Your Honor. Emma has already shown me that she's stronger and braver than I ever imagined. She doesn't need someone to fix her. She needs someone to love her and support her while she heals herself. And that's exactly what I intend to do." Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Reed and Emma as he considered his decision. Finally, he spoke. "This court has heard testimony about unspeakable crimes committed against innocent children. We have seen evidence of a conspiracy that used terror and murder as tools of political control. But we have also seen evidence of something far more powerful, the bonds of love and loyalty that can overcome even the darkest evil." The judge paused, and Reed felt his heart stop as he waited for the verdict that would determine their future. "Miss Emma Lark," Judge Morrison said, "you have suffered more than any child should ever have to endure. But you have also shown courage and strength that would be remarkable in an adult, let alone a 12-year-old girl. You deserve to be with someone who will cherish and protect you for the rest of your life." Emma gripped Reed's hand so tightly that her knuckles went white. "Mr. Maddox," the judge continued, "you have demonstrated your commitment to this child's welfare through actions that went far beyond legal obligation. You risked your life to save her, and you have given her the love and stability she desperately needed." Judge Morrison stood, and the entire courtroom rose with him. "Therefore, this court hereby grants full legal custody of Emma Lark to Reed Maddox with all the rights and responsibilities of a biological father. May God bless you both as you begin this new chapter of your lives together." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers as Emma threw herself into Reed's arms, sobbing with relief and joy. Dr. Wilson was wiping tears from his eyes, and even Marshal Kane was smiling broadly as he watched the reunion. But the legal proceedings were not quite finished. Judge Morrison still had to address the broader conspiracy that had been uncovered. As for the criminal conspiracy led by Hank Cooper, the judge said, his voice hardening, "This court finds sufficient evidence to recommend prosecution under federal conspiracy, murder, and racketeering statutes. Mr. Cooper and his surviving associates will face trial in federal court where they will answer for their crimes against the people of this territory." Over the following days, the full scope of Cooper's empire became clear as investigators continued to uncover evidence and arrest conspirators. Dozens of officials were charged with corruption, several businesses were seized for their role in money laundering, and the entire territorial government was reorganized under federal oversight. Emma and Reed watched these developments from the safety of Dr. Wilson's house, where they were staying while making preparations for their departure from Wyoming. They had decided to head west to Oregon Territory, where Reed had heard about opportunities for farming and where Emma could grow up far from the memories that haunted her in redemption. "Are you nervous about leaving?" Dr. Wilson asked Emma one evening as they sat by his fireplace planning their journey. Emma considered the question carefully. "A little, she admitted. "This is the only home I've ever known, even though most of my memories here are bad ones. But I'm more excited than nervous. For the first time in my life, I get to choose what happens next." Reed looked at her with pride and amazement. In just a few weeks, she had transformed from a terrified, broken child into a confident young woman who was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "What do you want to do in Oregon?" Reed asked. "I want to go to school," Emma said immediately. "Real school, not just the lessons Mrs. Stanton gave me when she wasn't busy hurting me. I want to learn to read better and do mathematics and maybe even learn to play the piano." "That can all be arranged," Reed said with a smile. "What else?" Emma was quiet for a moment, staring into the dancing flames. "I want to help other children like me," she said finally. "Children who are being hurt and don't have anyone to protect them. I don't know how yet, but someday I want to make sure no other child has to go through what I went through." Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. "That's a worthy goal, my dear. The world needs more people who are willing to stand up for the innocent." 2 days later, Marshal Kane arrived with news that would affect their departure plans. Cooper had finally agreed to provide testimony against his remaining conspirators in exchange for a life sentence instead of execution. His cooperation was leading to arrests throughout the territory and beyond. "There's something else," Kane said, his expression growing serious. "Cooper mentioned that he had sent word to associates in other territories about you and Emma. There may still be people out there who see you as a threat to their operations." Reed felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What kind of associates?" "The kind who don't give up easily," Kane replied grimly. "I'd recommend taking a very indirect route to Oregon and maybe changing your names once you get there, at least until we've rounded up the rest of Cooper's network." That night, Reed and Emma had a long conversation about their future and the precautions they would need to take. They decided to travel south to Colorado first, then west through Utah territory before finally heading north to Oregon. It would add months to their journey, but it would also make them much harder to track. "I have an idea about names," Emma said as they made their final preparations. "What if we became the Lark family in honor of my father?" Reed was touched by the suggestion. Taking James's name would be a fitting tribute to the man whose dying wish had brought them together. "Reed and Emma Lark," he said, testing the sound. "I like it." Dr. Wilson had insisted on accompanying them as far as Colorado, partly for Emma's medical care and partly because he had grown fond of both of them. The elderly physician had sold his practice and was planning to start over in a new territory where he could continue helping people without the shadow of Cooper's corruption hanging over him. On their last morning in redemption, the three of them visited the small cemetery where the victims of Clara's crimes had been buried. Fresh headstones had been erected for Margaret, Sarah, and Beth, the children whose deaths had been covered up for so long. Emma placed wildflowers on each grave while Reed and Dr. Wilson stood silently nearby. "I promise you," Emma whispered to the graves, "your deaths won't be forgotten, and I promise that what happened to you will never happen to anyone else if I can help it." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Emma turned back one last time to look at the town that had been both her prison and the place of her liberation. Redemption looked peaceful in the morning light, its snow-covered streets and cozy buildings giving no hint of the horrors that had been hidden behind its respectable facade. "Are you ready?" Reed asked gently. Emma nodded, her face set with determination. "I'm ready." Their wagon was loaded with supplies for the long journey ahead: food, warm clothes, books for Emma's education, and the legal documents that established their new identities as the Lark family. Hidden beneath the floorboards were Reed's guns and ammunition, along with a significant amount of money that Marshal Kane had provided from Cooper's seized assets. As they drove out of town, several people came out to wave goodbye. Reverend Benjamin offered a blessing for their journey. Sheriff Holden apologized once again for his role in nearly returning Emma to Clara's custody, and even some of the townspeople who had initially supported Clara wished them well. "They're good people, mostly, Dr. Wilson observed as they left Redemption behind. "They were just afraid and confused by Cooper's manipulation." "I know," Emma replied. "I don't hate them for believing Clara's lies. I just hope they'll be more careful about who they trust in the future." The first few days of their journey were uneventful, with clear weather and good roads making for easy travel. Emma proved to be an excellent traveling companion, adapting quickly to life on the trail and showing genuine enthusiasm for the adventure ahead. But as they approached the Colorado border, Reed began to notice signs that they were being followed. Dust clouds on the horizon tracks that appeared too regularly to be coincidental, and glimpses of riders who seemed to parallel their route without ever getting closer. "We have company," he told Dr. Wilson quietly when Emma was out of earshot. Wilson nodded grimly. "I've noticed. How many do you think?" "At least 3, maybe more. They're staying well back, but they've been with us for 2 days now." That night, Reed made a decision that would test all of their courage and resolve. Instead of continuing to run, he would turn and face their pursuers. It was time to end Cooper's influence over their lives once and for all. "Emma," he said as they made camp, "I need you to be very brave. The men who've been following us are going to make their move soon, and when they do, I want you to take Dr. Wilson and hide in those rocks over there." Emma's face went pale, but her voice was steady. "Are you going to fight them?" "I'm going to end this," Reed said simply. "One way or another." Dr. Wilson started to protest, but Reed cut him off. "Doc, your job is to keep Emma safe. My job is to make sure Cooper's people never threaten us again." As darkness fell, Reed positioned himself where he could watch the approaches to their camp while remaining hidden from view. Emma and Dr. Wilson retreated to the rocks as instructed, though Reed knew Emma would be watching everything that happened. The attack came just before midnight. 3 men approached the camp from different directions, their guns drawn, and their intentions clear. They expected to find their targets asleep and defenseless. Instead, they found Reed waiting for them with a rifle and 20 years of combat experience. The fight was brief but decisive. Reed's first shot dropped the leader before the man could even locate the camp. The second shot wounded another attacker, sending him stumbling back into the darkness. The third man tried to retreat but ran directly into Dr. Wilson, who had circled around behind them with his hunting rifle. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Cooper's men were dead, and the third was badly wounded but alive. Reed bound the survivors' wounds and extracted information about any other threats that might be waiting for them. "Cooper hired us through intermediaries," the wounded man gasped. "There might be others, but we don't know who they are or where they'll come from." It wasn't the definitive answer Reed had hoped for, but it was better than nothing. At least now they knew they were dealing with hired killers rather than Cooper's most trusted associates. The next morning, they buried the dead men and continued their journey with renewed urgency. The attack had proven that Cooper's influence extended far beyond Wyoming territory, but it had also proven that Reed was capable of protecting his new family from whatever threats they might face. As they crossed into Colorado, Emma surprised Reed by asking to see her father's photograph again. She studied James's young face for a long time, then looked up at Reed with tears in her eyes. "He would be proud of us, wouldn't he?" she asked, "for keeping the promise and for standing up to the bad people." "Yes," Reed said without hesitation. "He would be very proud of both of us." 2 months later, they reached the Oregon Territory town of Willamette Falls, where they found everything they had been hoping for: good land, honest people, and the chance to start over without the shadow of their past hanging over them. Reed purchased a small farm on the outskirts of town, and Emma enrolled in the local school, where she quickly proved to be an exceptional student. Dr. Wilson settled nearby and opened a new practice, becoming one of the most respected physicians in the region. The 3 of them remained close, sharing Sunday dinners and holidays as an unconventional but loving family. Emma thrived in her new environment, making friends easily and excelling in her studies, but she never forgot the promise she had made at the graves in Redemption. As she grew older, she began working with local authorities to identify and help other children who were suffering from abuse or neglect. Reed found peace in farming and in watching Emma grow into a remarkable young woman. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future he and Emma were building together. Years later, when Emma was grown and had become a teacher herself, She would often sit with Reed on the porch of their farmhouse and talk about the journey that had brought them together. They would remember James Lark, whose dying wish had set everything in motion, and they would give thanks for the bond that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful and enduring. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the Oregon sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Giving up your wandering life to take care of me?" Reed reached over and took her hand, marveling as always at how small it still looked despite everything she had accomplished. "Emma," he said softly, "you didn't take anything away from my life. You gave me a life worth living." She smiled and squeezed his hand, and in that moment Reed knew that every sacrifice, every risk, every moment of danger had been worth it. He had kept his promise to James Lark, but more importantly, he had found his true family in the process. The dying soldier's oath had become a living legacy of love, courage, and redemption that would endure long after the last echoes of that terrible winter in Wyoming had faded into memory. Emma Lark had survived, thrived, and would go on to save other children just as she had once been saved. The promise was kept, the debt was paid, and the circle of protection that began with one man's sacrifice had expanded to touch countless lives with hope and healing. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.